In the legendary basketball film White Men Can't Jump, Rosie Perez once uttered the line, "Sometimes when you lose, you really win." And I think that might have been the case for Ian Machado Garry at the weekend. Let's get into it. It's the RDX Sports Podcast. Welcome everybody, this is the RDX Sports Podcast. My name is Simon Head, and we're still kind of unpacking a busy week at the final weekend of the UFC's pay-per-view schedule. Just this past weekend in Las Vegas, UFC 310 served up a great night of fights. Alexandre Pantoja defeating Kai Asakura in the main event to cement that grip he has over the UFC's flyweight division. Great performance from Kai Asakura in defeat, really pushing the fight, but just wasn't quite on Alexandre Pantoja's level. But to kick things off on this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about the co-main event at UFC 310. Shavkat Rakhmonov defeating Ian Machado Garry via unanimous decision, 48-47 scores across the board. I don't think there was any controversy on those scorecards, but the really interesting thing that's come out of that fight is just where it leaves both men in the division. For Shavkat, it's pretty straightforward. He's earned himself a shot at Belal Muhammad and the UFC welterweight title. He was supposed to have that fight at UFC 310, but due to a nasty-looking foot infection from Belal, he was off the card. Shavkat agreed to take another fight, and to his huge credit, took a fight with an undefeated contender in Ian Machado Garry. A big fight for the division. Shavkat got the job done, but let's take a look at the flip side, at Ian Machado Garry, and that quote from Rosie Perez of White Men Can't Jump. Sometimes when you lose, you really win. And I honestly think that Ian Machado Garry, his stock went up a number of notches this past weekend, even though he suffered his first ever career defeat. Let's look into it and find out why that is the case. First of all, he did the UFC a solid. He actually helped the UFC keep that show at the level that they wanted it to be at. Belal versus Shavkat was obviously a title fight, but you could argue Shavkat versus Ian Machado Garry is a comparable level fight. Machado Garry, undefeated, looked really good in his UFC career up until the weekend, and then on Saturday went toe-to-toe with Shavkat. Great performance, a lot of cage work going on. Shavkat doing a lot of wrestling against the cage, but he couldn't really do a lot with Ian Machado Garry. He couldn't wrestle him to the ground like a lot of people thought he would do. Garry, I think, surprised a lot of people with his defensive wrestling, which we'll move on to in a second. But the issue here was the UFC had two title fights on the card for their final pay-per-view of the year and then lost one. If they'd have lost Shavkat as well, there would have been a reasonable drop down the card before they hit some more quality, and they would have been short of a really high-quality fight. Machado Garry stepping in on what I think was 2 weeks' notice was a huge help for the UFC, and I think that the UFC will remember that as they look to book Garry in 2025 and beyond. He has signed on the dotted line for everybody he's been offered, and he's gone in there and performed and done well. So that's point number one. He did the UFC a solid. The second point about Ian Machado Garry at UFC 310 was that, yes, he lost, but did he get exposed? No. Did he get dominated? No. It was such a slim margin of victory. It was 48-47 on all three scorecards, 3 rounds to 2. But you take a look at the rounds individually, some of them would probably decided by like maybe 1 or 2 strikes. Certainly the first couple of rounds, there was so little what you would call effective offense in that fight, whether it be effective striking or effective grappling. There was so much stalemate work on the cage that really those 2 rounds were largely determined by individual strikes. And it just so happened that Shavkat landed the slightly more eye-catching stuff in terms of those individual strikes in the first couple of rounds. If Garry had put his foot on the gas just a little bit more, he would have taken those rounds and he would have won that fight. So for him to know that and to be going back, and I'm sure he would have watched this fight already, and he's a very analytical guy. I think he's someone who processes a lot of information, likes to process a lot of information. He will already have looked at that fight and will probably be sitting back in his chair thinking, I left a fair amount on the table on Saturday night. Defensively, I think he was as good as we've ever seen Ian Machado Garry, put under a lot of pressure. And he did a great job of keeping Shavkat at bay. Offensively, I don't think we saw enough from him. I think he will probably agree that he didn't produce enough offensively when he was out in the open. And it was those moments that really defined the fight and determined which way that decision went. It was a strong performance from Garry, but the fact that he knows that he was far from at his best in terms of from an offensive standpoint, you can take that as a real positive heading into his fights in 2025. To not be at his best offensively against arguably the best contender in the division and to push him that close tells you just where Garry is in that welterweight division. And that is right up there. I think if Garry fights to his full potential on Saturday night just gone, he wins that fight. So there's an awful amount of positive feedback he can generate from watching that fight. There'll be an element of frustration there too, because he'll see it as an opportunity perhaps wasted or an opportunity missed. But he now knows his level. He now knows if there were any doubts, and I don't know if there were any with Ian Machado Garry, very confident man. But to see the way he performed, to see the way he shut down the most dangerous man at 170 pounds in the way that he did, and the knowledge that if only he had just pushed the pace just a little bit more, especially in those first 2 rounds, that would have been the difference, and it would be him heading into a title fight with Bilal, remember the name, Muhammad, in 2025. But overall, I think he won. He lost the fight, but he won overall. And I think as 2025 goes on, it'll be very interesting to see who the UFC book him with next. Whether they keep him in there with one of the bigger names in the division, or whether they give him someone like a Carlos Praches or someone like that who's really surging his way up the division. Whoever it is, it's going to be a big fight. And you would imagine that if Garry wins that next fight, he will be next in line to fight for the 170-pound title. So no real damage done, I don't think. All it's done is it's slightly slowed his rise to the title. That's it. But what it has done is given him valuable information. He now knows the level he can fight at. He believed it, but now he's seen it, and he knows that he left stuff on the table. That, coupled with the fact that he's helped the UFC out massively by agreeing to step in for such a difficult fight on such short notice, will only serve to help him as well as he moves into 2025. So it's true. Sometimes when you lose, you really win. And Ian Machado Garry lost on the scorecards, but career-wise, I think this was a huge uptick for him. I'm looking forward to seeing just what he does in 2025. Let's take a look at some of the other results from the main card at UFC 310. Ciryl Gane defeats Alexander Volkov, split decision, 29-28 either way. And the third one, 29-28, going for the Frenchman Bongaman. Ciryl Gane getting the win. I'll be flat out honest with you. I do not think he won that fight. I thought Alexander Volkov won that fight. I thought it was a reasonably clear 2-1 decision for Alexander Volkov. And I can completely understand his reaction when the scorecards were read. But the reaction of Ciryl Gane was very telling as well. He was really not happy with his own performance, and he walked out the cage, even though it was he who was announced the victor. And you very rarely see that. You don't see too many winners just basically storm off, which is what he did. And for a guy who is known for being a very laid-back, happy, affable, accessible kind of person that Ciryl Gane is and has been through his UFC career, to see that reaction tells you a lot about how he viewed that performance. He was really disappointed. It sounds like he might have broken his foot or his toe early on in the fight, which didn't help with his movement, and would certainly have contributed to the success that Volkov had, particularly in the stand-up. But yeah, it wasn't a great performance for him. And I think he was really hoping that would springboard him towards being kind of like a next man in line after Tom Aspinall in the heavyweight division. Whereas I think what it has done now, it's kind of hit pause on Ciryl Gane. Like, it feels like we need to see him again. We need to see a big performance out of him next time. And then with a bit more momentum, he could end up in there with a Tom Aspinall or someone like that. You know, maybe booking him with someone like Pavlovich would be a sensible thing to do next. Who knows? But, you know, and it's the flip side of the Rosie Perez quote. Sometimes when you win, you really lose. And it kind of felt a bit like that for Ciryl Gane on Saturday. Yeah, he won on the scorecards. Did he win in the court of public opinion? I don't think he did. And I think in his own mind, he didn't win either. So very interested to see what happens with him. As I say, usually a very happy, laid-back, affable personality. He was not a happy camper on Saturday night at UFC 310. And he'll be back to the drawing board for Bongamin as he gets ready for 2025. The UFC featherweight division saw two big fights on the fight card at UFC 310. Kicking off the main card was an absolute banger. Dooho Choi defeats Nate Landwehr by TKO, he says, checking the time. 3 minutes, 21 seconds of round number 3. And it was just a brilliant performance from Dooho Choi. Nate Landwehr is known for just charging out of his corner and bringing hellfire and brimstone to his opponents. Just everything, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at his opponents. He barely landed a glove on Dooho Choi. And that tells you just how good of a performance we saw from the Korean Superboy on Saturday night. He was as good as we've seen him, I think. He'd been away from the sport for a while. He had his national service he had to go through. He had injury problems he had to go through. There was a pandemic thrown into the mix. And it meant that it had been a long time since we'd really seen him. And he'd only had one win in 6 years because of all of that inactivity. And it really felt like this was a chance for Dooho Choi to hit the reset button. And he really did. And he did it in great style. Superb performance against Nate Landwehr. Slick boxing, working behind a really good jab. Even mixing in some takedowns and a little bit of wrestling in there. And, you know, some good grappling on the mat as well. We don't normally see that from the Korean Superboy. He is adding more tools to his tool bag. And it isn't just about standing and banging, which is what we've seen from him in most of his UFC career. Of course, there's that incredible fight with Cub Swanson that landed the pair of them in the UFC Hall of Fame in the fight wing. Their fight was an absolute cracker. Go back. If you've got UFC Fight Pass subscription, hop on and watch that fight. It is an incredible, incredible matchup. But Dooho Choi, while he enjoys being in fan-friendly fights, he enjoys putting on a show for the fans. I think if you sat him down and asked him, he would much, much rather go out there and defeat his opponents decisively with a great performance rather than have to go through an absolute 15-minute war where he's taken almost as much damage as he's dishing out. And that certainly wasn't the case this weekend. He barely took any damage at all. He really did. Landwehr barely landed on him. And it was just like the gap in class was just incredible. And while Dooho Choi was he the betting favourite in that fight? I think Landwehr may have been the betting favourite in that fight, which makes it even more incredible. I think largely because of Dooho Choi's inactivity. Maybe the odds makers fancied Landwehr having the better recent form and being more active. But yeah, absolute huge gap in class. And I really, really am excited to see what they do with Dooho Choi now, because the featherweight division is just absolutely chock full of killers. Wherever you book him, it's going to be a fun fight. But there's so much opportunity in that 145-pound division for Dooho Choi to make his way up, have some incredible fights, and who knows, maybe even get himself into title contendership. That would be incredible to see, and would maybe open the door to the UFC heading back to South Korea for an event. The atmospheres in those South Korea shows that they've done in the past were electric. And I know that they would welcome the UFC back with open arms for a show if they could do it. And if Dooho Choi can maybe pick up another win, get himself back in the rankings, maybe get himself towards top 10 level, he could headline a fight night card. If the UFC are taking things on the road even more in 2025, who knows? Maybe a Dooho Choi main event in South Korea might not be out of the question in the coming year. The other featherweight fight on the card at UFC 310 on the main card was Bryce Mitchell versus Kron Gracie. Now, I'm not going to lie, I've not been a huge fan of Kron Gracie as a top level UFC fighter. I just don't think. I think he's there largely on the strength of his name rather than on the strength of his performances. And against Bryce Mitchell, he was completely dominated. I thought Bryce Mitchell looked outstanding. His grappling was strong. He was tussling on the ground with Gracie, which is Gracie's wheelhouse, right? You know, that name is not to be underestimated. But Bryce Mitchell was the better man by some distance on the night. And when the finish came, it came via knockout. Gracie jumping the guillotine, or trying to jump guard rather, and Mitchell just slamming him down to the mat, which I'm sure dazed Gracie anyway, and then just followed up with some huge elbows, knocked him out. Big result. And Bryce Mitchell is another one. He, in that featherweight division where there is just so much talent, you could match Bryce against anybody and it'll be an interesting style matchup just because of Bryce's skill set. He is a pure grappler, pure wrestler. He can go out there, he will get you to the mat. But as we're seeing, he does have striking acumen. He does have the ability to sort of trade on the feet if he needs to. And he's certainly got strong ground and pound from top position. That was a huge win for him. And Dooho Choi and Bryce Mitchell in 2025? I don't know. That would be a real striker versus grappler matchup. But it was a big performance for him. And really, I don't know quite what happens with Kron Gracie next. It was a performance where he got badly beaten, and it'll be interesting to see how he gets booked next time around. But for Bryce Mitchell, he's now looking up those 145-pound rankings, and whoever he steps into the cage with, he's a danger man in that division. So a dangerous man to be in there with, and a very entertaining man to listen to on the microphone. You never quite know what you're going to get with Bryce Mitchell. And but no, I thought that was a big performance from him on a night where I think he really needed that for his own well-being and his own confidence heading into 2025. Great to see Thug Nasty back in the win column and building up some more momentum as he heads into 2025. All right, let's take a look at the various events we've got coming up this weekend on Planet MMA. We've got two events on the Friday night. Cage Fury Fighting Championships from Atlantic City, New Jersey on Friday night. My good friend John Morgan will be on the call for that one alongside WWE superstar CM Punk. If you've never seen a CFFC show, make this the first one you check out because it's their final MMA show of 2024. And John and CM Punk are a hilarious commentary duo. I've got to be honest. They're really, really good. They add extra personality to the whole event, and they make the event really fun to watch. Not that it needs any pumping up, by the way. The matchmaking is superb. The fights are always thoroughly entertaining. The crowds over there in the East Coast of the United States are always a little bit rowdy. They do a lot of shows in Philadelphia at the 2300 Arena, which is, for those wrestling fans out there, it's the old ECW arena. But now they're doing this one at the Hard Rock in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Really fun backstory to the main event. It's a light heavyweight title fight. Luke Fernandez, who has fought through the Cage Fury promotion, 6 fights as an amateur, won them all, became their amateur world champion at middleweight, then turned pro. He's won all 3 fights as a pro, and with his last fight, he captured the 205-pound professional MMA title for Cage Fury Fighting Championships. He now takes on the former middleweight champion, Greg Ellis, who was not supposed to be taking this fight. He was not supposed to be in this fight. They were trying to find someone for Luke Fernandez and were really struggling. Greg Ellis was supposed to be fighting somebody else. That fight fell through, and by complete fluke, I was talking to John Morgan about this. You can check out the article, which is going to be live on UFC.com, telling this very story. Ellis just noticed on a screenshot that they were also looking for a fight for Luke Fernandez and said, well, hell, I'll move up and fight him. And they're like, well, that's not really what we were planning for you. Don't worry about that. I'll move up and fight him. So he's moved up to light heavyweight, former middleweight champion, moving up to light heavyweight to challenge for the light heavyweight title. It's a main event that CFFC didn't know that they were going to have, but it's one that they've got, and it looks on paper like an absolute cracker. So Ellis, a lot more experienced in the pro ranks, has won championship belts before. Luke Fernandez has just picked up the 205-pound title. Undefeated as an amateur, undefeated as a pro. Lots of people tipping him to go all the way to the UFC. This will be a fun one in the main event in Atlantic City. So yeah, John Morgan and CM Punk on the call, live on UFC Fight Pass on Friday night. But that's not the only Fight Pass event on Friday night, because on the other coast, on the West Coast, in San Diego, California, we have Cage Warriors 182. Cage Warriors obviously based mostly over here in the UK, but they also have their base in the States over there in San Diego. That is the American home base, if you like. The Sycuan Casino Resort, I think it's pronounced. They have been playing host to Cage Warriors events for the last few years. Always fun events. Angela Hill will be on the call alongside, I think it'll be Brad Wharton, who's flying over for that one. But Angela Hill will be on co-coms. That's always entertaining. She does a great job on co-commentary on those American cards for Cage Warriors. And it's a big fight in the featherweight division. Two of the best Cage Warriors featherweights from the United States are going head-to-head. Damon Wilson, the Nomad, 7-2, looking to push himself towards a potential shot at that featherweight title currently held by Harry Hardwick. He takes on promotional newcomer, but a very experienced one in that, 22-fight veteran Ryan Lilly, who steps in looking to make an instant impact on his Cage Warriors debut. Other notables on this card, unbeaten welterweight Anthony Orozco. He's 4-0. He's building his way up the division as well. He's a lot of fun to watch. Former wrestler, very powerful. He's looking to pick up a win against Domenico Salas. Looking down the rest of the card as well, England's own Teddy Stringer. He's also undefeated. He's fights at lightweight usually. He's going to be fighting at a 160-pound catchweight this weekend against Darren Smith Jr., who is a 39-fight veteran of the game, and taking on Teddy Stringer, who will be making the walk for only his 5th professional contest. But Teddy the Magomedov, as he called himself when I was over in San Diego watching him and his teammates at the MMA Fight Academy, he is very, very good on the mat. He's developing his striking skills, but he's a slight anomaly because Brits tend to be associated more with the striking arts, but Teddy is a grappler through and through, and I'm looking forward to seeing how he gets on at Cage Warriors 182. That's live on UFC Fight Pass from San Diego, so you've got CFFC and Cage Warriors on Friday night. Take your pick which one you're going to watch live, but make sure you catch up on the other one. Both promotions putting on great shows to round out their respective calendars in 2024. That takes us to Saturday night. Saturday night is fight night. We have 2 big events coming to you from either side of the Atlantic. First of all, in Lyon, France, the PFL Europe season comes to a close with the PFL Europe Championship event. And the main event will be a huge showcase fight for one of the biggest stars on the PFL Europe roster. Abdurakhmonov, the Lazy King himself, returns to action, fighting on home soil against Argentina's Laureano Staropoli in a welterweight matchup. Abdurakhmonov can fight at welterweight, he can fight at lightweight, and he can be a problem in any weight class. This surely will be the last showcase fight we see from the Lazy King. And I really hope we get to see him in the PFL Global season next year, whether that be at 155 pounds or 170 pounds. I'm hoping it's at 155 pounds. I think that is his optimum weight class. But he will look to put on a show and close the show in style with his own special brand of grappling and scrambling on the mat, looking to round out the night with a submission victory as he bids to claim the 19th win of his professional career. That will be a lot of fun to watch. Another person worth watching is in the co-main event, Belgian star Patrick Habirora. He's only 4-0. He's working his way up the rankings, but he screams star. He's got that real... You just watch him. He looks like a star in the making. He's another one who could find himself... I would imagine he'll go into the PFL Europe season next year, but he does have the talent. If they want to take a punt on him, they could throw him into the global season. I think it might be a tad early for him. Build him through the Europe season, and then I think maybe after that, he could be ready to move into the global scene. But he's 4-0 as a lightweight. He's going to fight in a 165-pound catchweight contest against Swiss welterweight, I think he is, Katalin Safta. So I think Safta might be dropping down 5 pounds. Habirora meeting him at 165. That is your co-main event. But the PFL Europe Championships are all about those $100,000 finals and the championships being crowned. And there are 2 Brits set to compete in 2 of those finals. Lewis McGrillen, who wasn't even in the PFL Europe season at the start of the year, stepped in during the playoffs to take on Dean Garnett in one of the fights of the year. Absolutely brilliant performance from both men, but it was Lewis McGrillen, the McGrizzler, getting the job done in what was effectively the semi-finals of the tournament, and has thrown himself straight in to the championship finale where he could win $100,000, win the bantamweight championship for PFL Europe, and potentially catapult himself into the global season. He's a star in the making. He's a live wire. He's a bit of a handful to deal with. He says some crazy stuff on the microphone and he does some crazy stuff in the cage. But what he is must-see TV. That fight with Dean Garnett is one of the best fights of the year in 2024. He's taking on Germany's Alexander Luster, who is a submission specialist and fancies his chances strongly to get the McGrizzler out of there very early in the first round in that championship fight. McGrillen, of course, he's putting all of his stock in that punch power and being able to keep the fight standing and to put Alexander Luster away when he strikes. That will be a banger for as long as it lasts. That's in the bantamweight division. The other British challenger we have is in a lightweight division, and he has arguably the toughest test on the entire fight card. Conor Hughes is 10-1, has had a great season. He's worked his way up through the PFL lightweight season. He's now in the final, but he's taking on a man who's been there, seen it, done it, got the t-shirt, got the check, got the championship belt on his mantelpiece back home. Poland's Jakub Kazuba is undefeated, 13-0, and has been very, very strong all through this season and obviously the season before that. He's now gunning for back-to-back championships. He wants to win that PFL Europe lightweight title and really prove a point. Normally, you would expect you win the PFL Europe championship. The next step is to move into the global season. He wasn't moved into the global season. That might have annoyed him. Having done the hard yards and won the belt, and with an undefeated record as well, he wasn't given that opportunity in the global league. This, I think, will eliminate all doubt that the time is now right for Kazuba to move into the global league in 2025. But he's got to get past Conor Hughes first, and Hughes has looked really good during the season. This will be a real... I expect this to go the distance. All these championship fights will be over 5-minute rounds. Elbows will be allowed. This is a new thing in the PFL. The PFL don't normally allow elbows, but because these are the championship finales, there's no onward fights that they have to plan for immediately afterwards. Elbows are in play. Both guys have got strong top games, especially Kazuba. That could be a real benefit for him. But that is a big fight at 155 pounds on the European scene. The winner of that could well springboard into the global league in 2025. But more importantly, they'll walk away as a champion at the PFL Europe Championship event in France. Also in the tournament, Florim Zendelli taking on Daniele Michelli at 170 pounds. At 125 pounds, Paulina Wisniewska taking on Valentina Skitizzi. Skitizzi is 3-3 as a pro, but as tough as they come, gives everybody a really difficult fight and has earned her place in the championship final. She's up against undefeated opposition in 4-0 Paulina Wisniewska. That should be a good one at 125 pounds. We saw what happened to the winner of the 125-pound PFL Europe Championship last year. Dakota Ditcheva jumps to the world stage and just runs the table to win the world title in the PFL. She has shown the blueprint to everybody in PFL Europe, male or female, regardless of weight class, that the path is there. If you're good enough, if you're talented enough, and if you can level up your game as you move the way through the ranks, you can jump from PFL Europe Championship glory and make it all the way to PFL World Championship glory. And that's exactly what Dakota Ditcheva has done in 2025. That's one of the MMA stories of the year. And she's undoubtedly one of the fighters of the year. But that is the PFL Europe Championships event taking place from Lyon in France. But that's not the only fight night action we have on Saturday night. The UFC will host their final fight night show of 2024. And the main event is a doozy. 170 pounds. Colby Covington has decided to grace us all with his presence. He's back. And he's taken on Joaquin Buckley in a really interesting fight. For me, this is a crossroads fight for Colby Covington. You take a look at his record. It's been a while since we've seen him. We haven't seen him since the end of 2023. And you take a look at his recent form. He's alternated wins and losses in his last 6 matchups. He's lost twice to Kamaru Usman and he's lost to Leon Edwards, all in title fights. He's defeated Jorge Masvidal, he's defeated Tyron Woodley, and he's defeated Robbie Lawler in that spell. All 3 of those guys are no longer in the UFC. He does not have a win over an active UFC fighter in his last 6 fights. And that's a run stretching back a couple of years. It's a big, big fight for Colby Covington. He goes in there and smokes Joaquin Buckley. He's right back in there. And he can make as much noise as he wants in order to get himself a contender fight or maybe even another title fight. But if he loses to Joaquin Buckley on Saturday, then he could be staring through the trapdoor because he hasn't beaten anybody in the division in years. And if he goes and loses to Buckley, but the way Buckley beats you, it's not going to be good for you if you lose by knockout against someone like Buckley. You know, he is a brutal striker. He's got a lot of power. And if Covington ends up getting stopped in that fight, that's not going to look good on his record at all. It won't, it's not going to help his stock at all. Where's he going to go? What's he going to do? How much relevance is he going to have in that 170-pound division if he gets smoked by Joaquin Buckley? For Buckley, meanwhile, this is a great matchup. It's an opportunity to beat a guy who has been in and around the top of the division for years, who's fought for the title 3 times. If he can go in there and stop him, then that immediately elevates him into that upper bracket of contenders at 170 pounds. We talked about Ian Machado Garry and Shavkat Rakhmonov earlier on the pod. He's in the sort of the tier below those guys. He's going to want to try and bridge that gap and move a little bit closer to those guys. And who knows, an Ian Machado Garry Joaquin Buckley fight, which is what we were going to have in this event, that could still happen in 2025. With Machado Garry losing, if Buckley gets a big win, all of a sudden, that fight makes a lot of sense again. So we'll see how that one goes. If Numansa can get himself a stoppage victory, he's right there in the mix. And he'll know that a win over Machado Garry, I mean, that fight could even be a title eliminator, if you think about it, in 2025. They could face off in the first 2 quarters of the year, and that could be a title eliminator between Buckley and Ian Machado Garry. But he's got to get past Colby Covington. If Colby wins, maybe he gets to fight Ian Machado Garry, and that fight needs no selling whatsoever. Those two have been drawing at each other on social media for what feels like years now. Garry has always said that he is more than happy to step into the cage with Colby Covington. Covington has not seemed quite so keen to do that based on the things that have been said. Covington has said a lot of things about being the best in the division and all the rest of it, but you got to go in there, you got to be active, and you've got to win. And we'll see how he does against Joaquin Buckley on Saturday in Tampa, Florida. So very much home soil for Colby Covington. Co-main event, Cub Swanson versus Billy Quarantillo. Swanson's still going. Unbelievable fighter. one of the nicest guys in the sport, a real ambassador for mixed martial arts, someone whose story about martial arts changing his life has really resonated over the years. I know when the UFC was still looking to grow over here in the UK, Swanson was one of those fighters who, particularly when BT Sport launched, when I was working there, Swanson came over and did some stuff with BT Sport. He's just such an engaging, authentic personality, and someone that you do just gravitate to when you hear his story. He's taken on Billy Quarantillo, who's a real blue-collar contender, if you like, at 145 pounds. Hasn't quite made it to the very highest echelons of the division, but every time you see Billy Q in a fight, it is a fun fight. And this, to me, has got potential fight of the night quality to it in the co-main event. Looking further down the card, Manel Kape returns to action against Bruno Silva. Dustin Jacoby takes on Vitor Petrino in a light heavyweight fight. That could turn into a bit of a slugfest. Daniel Marcos versus Adrian Yanez should be good. Navajo Sterling, a highly touted prospect coming out of City Kickboxing in Auckland, New Zealand. He makes his UFC debut against the UK's Tuco Tokos, who trains and lives in Florida. So it's a home game for Tuco, but he's taking on Navajo Sterling, who has arrived in the UFC with a glowing endorsement and a huge knockout victory on Dana White's Contender Series. That's certainly one to keep an eye on. That's going to open up the main card on Saturday night. And looking a little bit further down the prelims, two fights I wanted to highlight. At featherweight, Miles Johns and Felipe Lima. Miles Johns has campaigned mostly at bantamweight. He's doing this one at featherweight against Felipe Lima, the former Octagon bantamweight champion, who earned himself a shot in the UFC and claimed a come-from-behind submission win on his UFC debut. Really talented Brazilian, loves to scramble on the mat, has excellent striking on the feet. Sounds a lot like Miles Johns. So that should be a really, really fun fight. I think their fighting styles are going to mesh really well. And that is another one you could put in the bracket for potential fight of the night contender. That one is early on the prelims. I think that's like the fourth fight from the start of the card. And the second fight from the start of the card, Britain's own Dangerous Davy Grant makes his long-awaited return to the cage. One of the nicest guys in MMA. I don't think there's a single person out there who has a negative thing to say about Davy Grant. Just an infectious personality, always happy, always brings the action, exciting fighting style. He was on the shelf for a while. He needed neck surgery. He got hosed in his last fight. There was a split decision that went against him. That did not go well for him. He's on his way back there now. He's looking to defeat Ramon Taveras, who was in a hugely entertaining fight himself earlier in the year. That should be an absolute banger. But that is UFC Fight Night in Tampa, Florida. It's going to be a lot of fun. Don't forget, check out the RDX Sports Podcast on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Make sure that you follow the podcast as every new episode lands on YouTube. You can get us on Spotify. You can get us on Apple Podcasts as well. And don't forget, you can follow me online across all the social platforms at Simon Head Sport. That's all we got for you on the RDX Sports Podcast this week. Enjoy the fights this weekend, and I'll speak to you next week.